Liam Halligan is an economist, author and broadcaster, best known for his award-winning economics agenda column in the Sunday Telegraph. He's also reported for the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Economist, Channel 4 News, and he's a regular panellist on my show, CNN Talk. A vocal Brexiteer, he argues the UK economy is stronger outside the European Union, which he explains in the book Clean Brexit. Between 2007 and 2013, he took time out from journalism for a role as chief economist at a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm, but he soon returned to his original passion of writing. He was the first member of his family to attend university, and here he describes to me how he rose from humble beginnings to the heights of the commentariat. Liam, thank you for speaking to me.
Nice to see you, Max.
How would you describe yourself? You're a columnist, famously. You're an economist, primarily.
Yeah, I'm an unusual combination of economist, political junkie, international relations aficionado, intellectual omnivore. I started life, my professional life, as an academic and then sort of transmogrified into a journalist. I worked early in my career for the Financial Times, at the Palace of Westminster as a political correspondent. I worked for The Economist, writing for them from Russia. And then for the best part of a decade, I was the economics correspondent on Channel 4 News.
They're big, high-profile brands. You were very young, weren't you, when you were working for the FT, for example? So you were a high flyer in those early days. How did you get onto that track?
Yeah, I think I was the youngest person on a national newspaper in the parliamentary lobby, the sort of press pack of Westminster journalists. I don't really know how I managed to do it. I'm from a completely unprofessional or non-professional background. Neither of my parents went to university. You know, none of my cousins are at university or my siblings or anything like that. I wasn't expected to go to university, but you know, I grew up in the 70s, and back then people from my kind of background weren't. I was very lucky. At the age of 10, I won a scholarship to a school in northwest London called the John Lyons School. So that allowed us financially to send me there. It was a bit of a culture shock. You know, I was from a sort of Irish background at a time when the hunger strikes were going on, the Troubles. Everybody else seemingly was from a professional family. But I was very proud because I left the school as head boy and had a really great school career. And now I'm a governor of the school, so I'm still very close to the school because it's like a social mobility factory. And then I went to university, I went to Warwick, I went to Oxford, did a couple of degrees in economics. But the way I really broke into journalism is that I went to Moscow. I went in the early days of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I had a chance to go with a group of academics from LSE to Russia. I grabbed that chance. I just thought, I want to become as expert as I can on a country that everybody is interested in, has to be interested in, and yet most people know very, very little about. So I went to Russia for a couple of weeks with some professors from the LSE, and I ended up staying a couple of years, much to the, not the shock, but the surprise of lots of people in my life. You have all these opportunities in the UK. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? What are you doing in Russia? But because I spent that time in Russia, I ended up getting a column on a local expat English language newspaper, the Moscow Times, which at the time was an incredibly influential paper. And I guess the economists were reading my Moscow Times columns, and literally out of the blue they rang me up and said, do you want to cover the 96 presidential election for us?
Where does the drive come from, do you think? That is the drive that you got in that senior school the same as the drive that took you to Moscow?
Yeah, I've always been somebody who has been prepared to, you know, break with the norms. I don't think I'm the kind of person who was ever going to take a conventional career path. It's sort of my inner Celt, I guess. And so it was a risk to go to Moscow at the time, and it was definitely a risk to stay there. I blew out my PhD at Oxford to stay in Russia. which was a source of great shame for me and regret. But life's about opportunity costs, and I decided that it was more interesting to stay in Russia and work for The Economist than go back and finish my what we call a DPhil in Oxford. And then I just always had this sense that why can't I do these things? I'm not from a background where people, join incredible organisations like The Economist and the Financial Times. I mean, I grew up in a house pretty much with no books, but I used to do a paper round and I would be late for school because I read the papers and I'd read all the columnists and was ferociously interested in current affairs. For me, current affairs wasn't a parlour game. It affected my life because of the tension between, my overwhelmingly Irish household and family, Irish Catholic background, and what was going on out there on the street and what the BBC was saying. So for me, becoming very, very interested in politics and current affairs at an early age, it was completely natural that I did.
It's interesting though, because it doesn't come from your family; it comes from your own experience of your upbringing and your community.
Well, it does come from my family in the sense that my mother's Protestant, my father's Catholic, and we've always had pretty muscular conversations about the world. And from a very young age, a lot of people like me from Irish backgrounds and London Irish backgrounds, Anglo-Irish backgrounds, you better have a good argument if someone comes at you, because they're not going to hold back. And it's the same, you get pulled out of bed at 3 a.m. at 5 years old, stand on a table, there's 50 people in the kitchen, sing a song. That's the kind of household that I grew up in. So I've never been afraid to say what I think. It's a source of some mystification for me that there are so many journalists out there, even columnists, who don't say what they think. They're constantly hedging, calibrating, calculating. I've never been like that. I just, I've got this platform to say things that I've earned and won, and you try and keep hold of it. But I think that's a great privilege. So I am going to tell ordinary people what I think. And I'm sure there have been times in my career, and there are now, and there will be in the future, where the things that I've said have completely stymied my progress in particular organisations. But I've always felt it's better just to be honest about, so your opinions are the end of your thoughts and the end of your research. They're not ends in themselves. And sometimes the things I've written about sensitive news stories in my columns have got me into lots of trouble, and I've lost friends. But I think in the end you have to be honest with your readership and the public and with yourself. And I'm hoping, Max, it will all work out in the end.
Well, what you're describing there is sort of a debate within journalism about whether you express your opinions or whether you are independent, you represent everyone's opinions.
Yeah, but comment people. I'm overwhelmingly now a comment person. I started out as a news person, very much so, at the Financial Times. Unlike a lot of comment people, I'm actually a trained news reporter. I can write news and I know what a news story is. An awful lot of people in our rather unmeritocratic industry, Max, come into opinion writing. They're sort of anointed age 22 and they don't do any news. They just go straight into opinion, often through family connections. I'm not being bitter about this. I've won British Press Awards, I'm an established newspaper columnist. I'm just telling people on your podcast what is actually happening. It's not that the best news reporters then become columnists. Some of them don't want to become columnists and opinion formers, if you like. But an awful lot of very young people with no experience end up becoming columnists for whatever reason. I think that's a shame. I think the lack of diversity in the opinion of a lot of our commentariat is terrible. It's a source of big regret. I think the commentariat is increasingly, overwhelmingly, for instance, pro-Remain. Certainly the broadcast media also.
On Brexit.
Yeah, is overwhelmingly pro-Remain. And, I get in lots of trouble for saying that, but it's absolutely clear to anyone with an open mind and eyes in their head. Look at the panels on television. Whenever I go, I'm allowed to go on these panels, I'm always the only Brexiteer. Now, CNN Talk is a bit different. When we talk about Brexit, it so happens that our core team is, Aisha, Hazarika, Ian Dale and myself. And, that's where I met you. That's where we launched a show a year and a half ago. And both Ian and I both voted for leave. But that's very much the exception. rather than to what regularly occurs on UK broadcast media, which is the panels are almost always overwhelmingly stacked towards Remain.
So the disruptor in you, the person that's able to express yourself, comes from your upbringing in those sort of vibrant conversations in the community. But where does the confidence to believe that you can actually succeed come from when you're saying many people from your community wouldn't have tried to do what you've done?
Well, my confidence comes from the fact that I've never been given a leg up as some kind of quota or token, if you like. Again, a very emotive word. I won the scholarship to the school I went to because I came top in the exam, and the teachers told me that years later.
And that was a big boost at the time.
Yeah, I was up against a load of kids who'd been prepared and tutored. I'd never sat an exam in my life. I went to a very ordinary primary school, completely mixed ability, and I was up against a lot of kids from prep schools and all the rest of it. And I know that how I got the scholarship because, I became very close to the headmaster and a lot of the teaching staff in subsequent years. Is because of my English language composition, just the ability to write stories. So my writing has always been the thing that has driven any success that I've had, and I guess I'm better known as a broadcaster. But I'd say to any aspiring journalists here, and even aspiring broadcasters, maybe even particularly aspiring broadcasters, Max, it's all about the writing. It's writing. That is the bedrock of all journalism. Good, clear, concise, muscular but subtle writing at pace. Even for an out-and-out broadcaster like you, I mean, you've had great success writing stuff in recent years. You know how hard writing is. But even the prerequisite of clear writing is clear thinking. And if you can think straight under pressure, that makes you a great broadcaster.
But you need to have some sort of cause as well, because you're so powerful in your speech and your language, because you really know what you believe in politically, but also just generally.
I'm not, unlike my fellow panelists on CNN Talk, and I don't deride them for 1 minute. I admire them. They are party political people. Ian's not in the Conservative Party at the moment, but he has over many years been a Conservative Party candidate, and he's worked at the highest echelons of the Conservative Party. Similarly, Aisha, one or both of them could easily end up in Parliament, I think. That's not me. I'm not a party political person, and I just can't be a party political person, because in the end I'm just not prepared to not say what I think. And as a party political person, you often have to temper what you think. I actually feel, it sounds a bit mad, but I feel tremendous responsibility to have come from the background that I've come from, and to have won this opportunity to appear on shows with you on CNN and the BBC when they let me on, and have newspaper opportunities. I feel a real obligation to say it exactly as I see it, because there aren't that many people really from very ordinary backgrounds at the top end of the British commentariat, and that's a shame. There used to be, when we were growing up, there were many people who'd come through from the regional press, which was once a very powerful influence on the national press here in the UK. In Fleet Street, you'd have all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds winning their berth in London, coming from the big regional newspapers and the big regional broadcasters, and bringing a lot of light and shade to a London-dominated media. A lot of that's gone, and so our media now is populated at the upper echelons of both on-screen and off-screen, writing and non-writing people and executives. It's much more kind of socially homogeneous. It's much less representative of the broad swathe of this amazing United Kingdom that we live in. And I think that has been shown, I'm afraid, again, I have to come back to it, during the run-up to the Brexit debate, and in particular in how our political and media establishment has responded to the Brexit referendum.
That was the liberal elite who didn't see Brexit coming because they hadn't really left London enough.
And many of them, they didn't see it coming. I totally saw it coming. I the background I'm from, and I live outside the M25, talk to lots of people in local pubs. You know, if you only hang out with people like you, then you're not going to understand when a vote goes a different way. And I think since the referendum, there's just been overwhelmingly negative responses from the sort of London-centric media classes to a decision they don't understand, and a decision that they feel it's their entitlement, an important word, to reverse.
I agree with you. I think in newsrooms there's not enough economic diversity. We've done well with other types of diversity, but not in terms of economic diversity. But do you think that's because you have to do a lot of free work to get into the business, and a lot of the entry-level salaries are really low, and you have to work in places like New York and London to get in there, and it's very expensive? Or do you think it's that people haven't got the confidence to apply for that type of career because they don't see themselves within it? It's not for them.
I think it's a bit of both. And of course, there's a downward spiral, because the harder it is to get in, the fewer people like you, who not just look like you, but sound like you see up on screen, or people you know are writing in newspapers. Of course, there's a barrier to entry where you have to be able to work free in London in order to get a foot in the door. And, you know, lots of people are now talking about that, and maybe, you know, non-paid internships should be banned. But even if they're banned, it's still a lot of it about is who you know, I'm afraid. You know, I was lucky. I managed to go abroad. I managed to be paid to go abroad to a very interesting place because I was, you know, an academic, an econometrician who was able to go to Russia under academic auspices. But then I took that opportunity to write stuff and literally fax it back in those days to newspapers in the UK, you know, often aside from my main job, which is a very demanding job as a statistician at that time, and just say, you know, do you want to run this? This is what I think. This is different from what you're reading in most newspapers.
But that takes a lot of confidence, which is not everyone's got.
You just got to really want to do it.
Yeah.
You just got to think it's your destiny to do it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's arrogant. I would say it's determination and courage. You just have to really want to do this. Like, I remember as that kid delivering those newspapers early in the morning, reading stuff that I just knew wasn't true. And it really upset me. And I thought, this is not right. This is in this amazing newspaper, and I know that's not true. And so that kind of galvanized me to think, well, surely there has to be scope for somebody to try and put that right. And also at that time, there were amazing columnists, you know, people like Bernard Levin, right? Bernard Levin, the son of a poor Jewish tailor. I remember looking up his life story in the local library. I think, God, the son of a poor Jewish tailor from the East End has now got this column on the Times. Maybe I can do that. Maybe I can do that. And I remember hearing through sort of family connections that John Cole, then the BBC political editor with his famous herringbone jacket, the Ulsterman, you know, he was the son, I think, of somebody working in a shipyard. He didn't even go to university. And there he was on the BBC. And I think, wow, maybe you can do it. But someone like me had those role models that we could find out who they were and think that could... I think my equivalent, a kid sitting in a box room in a salubrious suburb of London, you know, obsessively following the news, dreaming, son of an immigrant, has even less chance than I did, and that is anti-progressive.
But would you advise them to try to dig those people out in the way that you did to inspire you, if you really do believe you can do that job?
Yeah, I would. And look, a lot of people want to be, I want to be a journalist because I want to be famous. I want to be on the television. You know, we obviously live in a culture where, you know, fame is apparently more important than anything else. You can be famous even if you don't have any particular talent. But that's not what it's about. And you know that. I'm sure people say the same thing to you, Max. You do it because even though it's really hard work, it's even harder work not to do it. You know, every single newspaper column I write, and I've written, you know, thousands, every single one is tough. There's never an easy column. There's always a a kind of sense of, oh my God, the subject's too big. How do I get my head around it? Oh my God, I should have filed it half an hour ago. I hope my colleagues at the Sunday Telegraph aren't listening. And there's enormous pressure, but it's that pressure that builds up. And the only thing you can do is write the thing. And you're laughing with recognition. You put yourself in these crazy positions, but I actually believe the way the human brain is wired, or at least the way my brain is wired, and I've talked to lots of other columnists about this, is you kind of rely on yourself that, you know, it's not, oh, I wrote that column in an hour. Yeah, but it took me a lifetime to write it, because it is the culmination of, you know, thousands of hours reading, talking, thinking, observing. My sense is that when you really put yourself under pressure to do something, whether it's to fax something in the 90s or the early 2000s to an editor you've never met, whose fax number you've hustled off somebody in the middle of the night, or writing a column that's going to be on the pages of a national newspaper tomorrow and the page is about to go, I think when you build up this kind of head of steam inside you, and the only thing you can do is write it. There's nowhere else to go. You just have to write it. And I think at times like that, your best and clearest thoughts bubble to the surface. Somehow, I don't know how it works, the essence of the issue that you're trying to express. And someone like me, I often write about very, very complex things. I don't write about primary colours issues. I write about, you know, things like auditing and where the oil price is going. Stuff that's very, very important, but is often outside of the mainstream. But I'm writing always for a mainstream audience, a non-specialised audience. You have to get to that kind of pith and essence of an issue. And I find, and I know a lot of other journalists do, you only really get there when you are absolutely what we call up against it. You're up against the clock and you have to write the thing. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos.
Would you advise people to push themselves then to that extent? Because a lot of people would get to that point and think they'd actually give up. What is it that makes you push through and get to the deadline?
Fear of failure and letting people down. You know, there's a hole in the page, right? There's a hole in the page. It's got your name on it. What are you going to do? You know, live broadcasting is the same, Max. You obviously have many, many hours of experience. And I've got quite a few hours myself. It's just a sense that there is an enormous responsibility here. And particularly on CNN Talk, particularly with, you know, the team that I'm part of and lucky to be part of, we try and keep it light and we try and keep it personable. But these are issues we really, really care about. And we've done a lot of work to think about and find out what our views on certain issues. And we know that there's a tremendous responsibility. Firstly, you're on a high wire, right? We could, you know, half a sentence that's libelous or scurrilous or, well, it'd be slander, wouldn't it, if I was speaking it rather than writing it, or, you know, profane, and you're finished. I mean, you would be sacked, and rightly so. And yet we have to be human and natural and spontaneous, even though we're working within those rails. What I would say about this show, mainstream media often gets mocked and criticised, but, you know, CNN and Channel 4 News the same. When I was on Channel 4 News for many years, no one's ever told me what to say. I just say what I think, but you have to keep it clean and it's family viewing and all the rest of it. But you just have to have this kind of inner confidence and reliance on yourself that you've done this for long enough that you are not going to make those huge, enormous, cataclysmic errors that would get yourself and your broadcaster in trouble.
So work hard to get the credibility, the experience, the expertise that you need to do what you ultimately want to do.
And the best way to sound natural and to know to sound as if you know what you're talking about is to know what you're talking about, which is a lot of hard work.
You've also got a podcast as well where you have a very high bar of the guests you speak to. They're very successful people. What have you learnt from your insights into them about what they might have in common? Because they're from a variety of backgrounds, aren't they?
So I have a podcast I've run a podcast for a couple of years called Lend Me Your Ear, and I generally speak to other economists. So I've spoken to people like Amartya Sen, Richard Thaler, who both won the Nobel Prize in economics. I'm lucky to know people like this from my academic life, and I still have a foot in academia. I work with various universities. I've interviewed Michael Lewis, the author of Liar's Poker. I've interviewed Stephanie Kelton, who's a very interesting lady. She was Bernie Sanders' chief economic advisor. So I try and be, from the centre right, and the centre left. I think what all these people have in common is what all successful people have in common, and it's something that I try to tell my 3 kids. Yes, there's talent, and you need talent, but there's an awful lot of unfulfilled talent out there. And success, it's a cliche, but it's true. It is 10% inspiration, your talent, but it's 90% perspiration. And often it's just about, climbing out of bed at 5 a.m. and writing the piece, right? I've written so many good pieces in my head, but they don't actually get written. You just got to get out of bed and write the piece. It is all about having talent. You need talent. That's a given. But there's lots of people out there with talent. But it's overwhelmingly, the critical thing is hard work, determination, not taking no for an answer, but still being polite and reasonable, or at least giving the facade of being polite and reasonable when you really want something to happen. So it's also about being curious. If you're not really curious about the world, if you don't stay up all night and watch the election because you just have to know what's happening, if you don't obsessively read periodicals, if you don't feel a sense of determination to do something a bit different with those summers, if you're at university, if spend some time working, making some money, but if you've got the chance to go and do something, are you just sort of going to go to the beach with all your mates, or are you going to go to some crazy country just because you've read about it? If you're not behaving in that way, you probably shouldn't be a journalist. It isn't a profession, Max, as you know, it's a trade, and it's more even than a trade, it's a vocation. You do it, and I went off and spent some time in business to make some money, because God knows there isn't a huge amount of money in journalism these days unless you are wildly successful and very, very, well, I'd say not successful, I'd say wildly lucky, and you happen to be in the right place at the right time. But I found I just had to come back to journalism, and I was always going to come back to journalism, and my friends and colleagues in business knew that to my fingertips I was a journalist. And it's like an itch. You got to scratch it. It's a drug, and I'm an addict.
And you've got to stick to the career where you have the real passion and the sense of cause.
I think so. I mean, the best advice I can give to people listening to this who want to get into journalism is the route to a really happy life is to find what you like to do and get paid for doing it. I would anyway be reading the papers and watching the news obsessively, as I know you would, Max, because I just want to know what's going on. And the fact that I can get paid to write columns, however painful they are, is a wonderful thing, because that legitimizes me spending all this time following the news. And, it's not just about being on screen or being that named columnist. There are some tremendous opportunities in broadcasting, in particular, on the technical side. Camera crews, graphics people, logistics people. We have some great people here at CNN. The team I work with at Channel 4 News, I'm still friends with a lot of them, second to none. We Brits, we're really good at this stuff. We're really good at making telly. We're particularly good at making television news. We've pioneered a lot of the techniques over the years, both at the BBC and at ITN, by the way. And there's a lot of work to be done, and it's good work, and it's well-paid work, and it's work you can travel with if you have really good skills as a technical camera crew, as a graphic designer, as a kind of links person, sort of broadcast engineer. And there are some really good vocational courses that you can find on the internet after your A-levels. Go to university, and the job rates after a lot of these courses are very, very high, because these kind of graduates who really have a instantly usable and employable skill are very sought after.
Liam, thank you very much indeed.
Nice to see you, Max.